Destigmatized Mental Health Podcast, Season 5, Episode 4. I am here with Lisa Gartner. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, before we get started, where can people find you? How can people connect with you?
My website is faithfieldteaching.com and my Instagram is faithfield_teaching.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Before we've gotten a chance to talk, you've sent me a couple messages and, thanks for reaching out and just even listening to Destigmatize. I'm always happy to go ahead and talk to anyone and be able to discuss their journeys, but your journey is and your work is very unique. You have this background in special education. You're currently completing your board certified analyst certification, which is the BCBA certification. What was your journey that led you to focus specifically on the intersection of behavioral science and autoimmune diseases?
So it's multifaceted. So I know that like we talk about mental health and trauma. So in the height of the 2020 pandemic, of course, everyone I think dealt with a little bit of trauma because our whole world's collapsed and shut down. But prior to that, so like 2019, I started having autoimmune disease symptoms, and they came in and they searched my classroom and where did you get this walker? Who gave it to you? And it was really hard because they were saying, oh, it's depression. Oh, it's stress. Oh, it's a bad diet. And not only was I not walking, it's like you look up the DSM of the symptoms of, anxiety, depression, and all my symptoms were not on there. And so I started to take really detailed, like, logs of my symptoms, and that's kinda where it got started.
Gotcha. Yeah, you mentioned being committed to destigmatize this invisible illness, as you've called it, as you and I have spoken. And for those who might not understand what some of the mental health challenges that come with having symptoms like this unpredictable fatigue or any sort of medical demands that the outside world can't see, how would you be able to explain that to those individuals?
I think for me, it's multifaceted as, like, I've been born and raised in the Christian church, and there's a lot of Bible verses that talk about, the woman that was bleeding and all she wanted to do was touch Jesus's robe and she would be healed, and he was like, "Who touched me?" And he healed her, and you see all these stories of immediate healing, and it can be hard to read those stories knowing that you're not healed and question if it's, like, a lack of faith in the beginning, and it can wreck your mental health a little bit because I think the symptoms and the mental health is so intertwined, not only together, but also with the spiritual aspect as well. And then as you grow and you kind of, progress, you learn about not only is there a big community of people who deal with this, yourself and you can connect with, but there's people that are dealing with it that don't have a title per se of, oh, I have lupus or I have Hashimoto's or whatever the autoimmune disease is that you can minister and I think reach out to. And it gives a level of passion and a level of calling, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because we just tend to really go into a provider and trust them in a lot of ways that just simply because of the fact that they're doctors, that they're medically trained, we're going to go with their opinions, and it's just going to be what they say because they're knowledgeable and we trust them. However, most people really don't engage in that self advocacy component because of the fact that we trust them, we believe them. Say that that's fair.
I definitely agree with that. And I would say for me, I was a nursing major before I became a teacher, and I didn't go through the full hoops, but I got my nursing assisting license. So I was, in charge of taking vitals and doing rounds. And so when doctors say, oh, you have endometriosis, but did not do a fluoroscopy, did not do a blood test, did not do an MRI and all these medical imaging and put you on birth control. And then you start having joint pain and you start, it was that moment where you're like, I trust you, or I did trust you, but now I don't know that I trust you anymore. And where that's scary is you want to be able to trust them also for a referral to the appropriate provider.
You shared with me that during the height of the pandemic, you faced some significant health scares that eventually led you to a diagnosis of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. Can you take us back to a time and share how that personal experience changed the trajectory of your career? Saying, you just mentioned you were a nursing major and now you went into teaching and now you're going into um, BCBA. So, it's been a shift in your journey. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I was a nursing major, kind of have never liked science long before I became a nursing major. Had a really great high school chemistry teacher who mentored me and was like, I'll read for you, but just know like you're probably gonna hate this because you hate science. And I took anatomy twice, and it was that moment where I was like, I just don't feel like this is for me because like I put everything into it and I just know the curriculum's gonna get a whole lot harder. And so I went to school to become a teacher, and I was working as an instructional assistant. I had worked preschool through high school, mod severe classrooms, mild mod classrooms, TLC classrooms, whole gamut. And then, in the 2020 pandemic, I was a first year teacher, so the 2020 school year. And that's kind of when all my symptoms started. Looking back, though, I would say the anxiety and depression the year before my first year of teaching was kind of like the start of my symptoms, and I had a lot of GI symptoms that I thought was just anxiety related. And it just took a little bit of time for symptoms to develop. So that was like the start of the symptoms. And then just slowly over the course of time, it just snowballed into more.
Yeah. It sounds like your own health journey kind of propelled you into the field of BCBA. Does that non-traditional way for our listeners, does it feel different because of what you went through? I mean, how did you apply behavioral science to your own recovery and management?
Well, it started actually with the discovery of the autoimmune. So it was when I eat this food, these are the symptoms I have. So we call it an ABC contingency in BCBA work or three-term contingency. Usually it's like kid sees a cookie, kid presses an iPad for a cookie, parent gives them the cookie. For me, it was like when I go out to the sun, I will have these symptoms. I'll have joint pain or I have gnarly fatigue, and then it prevents me from doing whatever I need to do or what to do afterwards. Or I would apply it to caffeine intake, or, if I went to the gym and overdid it, and just started to take a really detailed log of my symptoms and did some research as well. Cause like I said, doctors were not taking me seriously.
Hmm.
And so I got to the point where I was like, I'm not a doctor, but at some point I narrowed it down to like, I think it was like 4 or 5 autoimmune diseases that like looked really similar. And then they did an MRI because they thought it was multiple sclerosis. And that multiple sclerosis, the MRI was negative. And so that's kind of how it started.
Yeah. And I mean, just going through that the doctors didn't really believe you. How did that affect you personally? How did that, walk us through that, through those emotions? Because I'm sure that must be exhausting and just disheartening to really minimize literally your physical symptoms.
Yeah. So for me, it was hard emotionally and like mental health wise, but also spiritually because, you're taught like perseverance produces character and character hope as a Christian. And you're taught trust the Lord and he will make it path straight. And there's so many Bible verses, that talk about healing and, you're not getting better. And then it messes with your mental health and it ramps up your anxiety because you're like, well, I've taught all these things in the Bible, and I believe these things and I know these things to be true, but I'm not seeing the physical healing right now. And so you kind of get to this point where you're like, do I actually believe what Jesus says? Is it really depression and stress? And it's like a really gnarly mind game. And it also is hard when you have a lot of friends dealing with mental health issues as well. And you see them out doing marathons or you see them out doing triathlons and you're sitting there going, wait a minute, this isn't adding up at all, for me.
Right. In a sense, it questions your faith and everything that you grew up knowing. I think that's pretty common in the mental health field. There's so many individuals that will come in and be able to go ahead and say, I feel like I'm losing my faith. I feel like I'm just losing what needs to go ahead and happen in that sense. How were you able to go ahead and get past that, or did you get past that?
Yeah, I have a really great mentor who I've known my whole life in the church, and her son has, I don't know the exact diagnosis, but it's not an autoimmune disease, but has become wheelchair bound as a result. And she would point me through scripture. She would go to appointments with me and pray with me and just remind me to stay the course. And then the other thing I didn't talk about that I think is really important to talk about is my dad, who adopted me, my parents adopted me, like I mentioned, had a brain tumor and he had lost his hearing before I was born. And so I think that also tied into how the church responded because my parents have gone to the same church before I was born. And I think for them, there was a level of fear of like, we've seen this in this family before and like complete utter shutdown, I guess you would say. And so it was really helpful to have her just be someone to walk me through that who wasn't a mom, who wasn't a dad of mine, who didn't, I mean, obviously a friend and a mentor and still emotionally invested, but has been able to do that beforehand, before the situation with her own kids. And I think I can't speak for her, but I would assume that that would help her detach a little bit more as she's walking this process with.
Right. Yeah, and that's it's really interesting as, individuals that do lean on the faiths that they do have this mentor and there are people that do show up that continue to guide them towards that component. Myself, it's definitely interesting because I consider myself an agnostic. So I definitely believe that there is something out there. However, I wouldn't be able to go ahead and get into the faith, but there are so many individuals that do talk about that and be able to go ahead and have mentorship and be able to go ahead and have community. And that's just such a beautiful thing to have in all reality. When we're recording this, this is 2026 at the time of the recording. And from, what our communication, my understanding is that you're currently in remission. Is that correct?
So I have two. I have lupus and RA. So the RA is in remission, the lupus is still active. But yeah, so
Okay. And so for someone that may be listening who is in the thick of it, of getting a new diagnosis or is in a painful flare up, what did that process teach you about the links between your mental state and your physical healing?
I think for me, part of it is learning that it's part of the process, unfortunately, because flare-ups will come, but there's not a cyclical pattern, meaning that it could be impacted by the weather. And as we know, we can't control the weather, right? You can focus on your mental health, you can focus on pursuing Jesus, but you can't control the weather. And so learning that I think the flare-ups are going to happen, unfortunately, and you don't know always when they're going to come has been really helpful. But also knowing that if you have a pattern of weather changes affecting it, like perfect example is this week. Normally where I live, it's like 60, 70 degrees and it's been in the high 80s. And so I've had a little bit more symptoms. And so I think you get to this point where you just know, okay, I gotta hydrate more. I gotta stay out of the sun, gotta do my sunblock so that maybe my symptoms are a little bit less, but knowing there's probably gonna be a little bit more symptoms than there traditionally is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess how, someone that may not fully understand what lupus does to the body, what does it do? Walk us down a winter day, a fall day in comparison to like a spring, summer day.
So the thing that makes it hard is that lupus can cause, like, there can be arthritic symptoms, and same with RA, obviously, RA is rheumatoid arthritis. And when you have an overlap, I feel like, and I can't speak to other people who have an overlap, sometimes it's really hard to say, like, this is lupus and this is RA because they're so intertwined and so many things overlap. But like for the winter time, especially not this winter, but the winter before, it was brutal. So it'll cause joint pain, joint stiffness for me, sometimes some muscle weakness in my legs, especially. But then when it's really, really hot, I might get dizzy, I might get nauseous, and that's with drinking a lot of water. Still might sometimes have that joint pain. I'm like today, I have a little bit of more joint pain in my wrists and stuff that are super minor, but it just will vary from day to day, to be honest.
Right. And it sounds like you have to do a full body scan mentally to be able to go ahead and kind of assess, all right, what is it that I'm going through, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and that is contingent to change even by the hour.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's one of those things where you just get used to it, and I know that sounds really bad, but you get to this point where you're like, "Okay, I know that, like, this happens," and so that mental health part of it is not as strong, of a presence, I guess you would say, in the factors, but you get to this point where you're like, "Okay, what do I normally do in this situation?" Uh, Ibuprofen, or I happen to have a prescription of prednisone, and I don't love taking it, but if it's super, super bad, I will take it for, like, 3 days or so, and then I will cut off. But I have to be pretty bad to want to take it, because sometimes I've taken it feeling like I need it and it hasn't done anything, and sometimes I've taken it and it's helped tremendously, and so, you just kinda gauge, like, where am I at today? Is this can Aleve help with my symptoms today? And if not, then, prednisone or taking it easier. You just kinda adjust as you go along.
Right. But for you to be able to go ahead and get a controlled substance as a prescription, that means that you were able to go ahead and self advocate enough to be able to go ahead and get that appropriate diagnosis.
Yes. Yes. So in addition to prednisone, I have what's called Benlysta, and it's a lupus-only medication. So for about 2 years, I was on infusion. So every month, I'd have to go to the doctors and sit with an IV in either my hand or my arm for an hour. You can't go if you're having, symptoms of, like, colds and flus, so you have to reschedule. Then when they said, like, my stuff was in remission because I have such a busy schedule, I was like, "Can I please do the auto injector so that way I can just go about my, you know, month and not have to reschedule appointments," because appointments are usually, like, almost, like, set in stone. It's like, if it's 12 o'clock on a Thursday once a month, that's your date, and so it gets hard when you get sick. It gets hard because all of that changes. So now I do it once a week, and it's just a simple shot that I just do it in my stomach, takes about minute or 2, and then I go about my week.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about the systemic component of it, being able to go ahead and discuss the medical providers and how, from a systems perspective, this is your appointment. Show up, don't show up. If you're late, you're screwed. If they're late, it's fine. Walk me down that process. And I'm sure so many people could go ahead and relate to that as well.
I think I've gotten really lucky. I have really good doctors. I tried my best to, like, always, stay on my appointments and be on time. My lab situation, when they asked me to do labs, that's a whole nother story. I am the worst at doing labs in a timely fashion. But to just be brutally frank and honest, for the infusion part, it's a little bit easier. You're supposed to show up 15 minutes beforehand. You do your intake. They ask you a couple questions about symptoms you might be having, that are related either to, I know it was big when we were in COVID, so symptoms of COVID, but also there's some side effects that you can have from the medication that they'll ask you about. And if you don't have them, you'll go into the room and they'll start your IV basically, and you sit there for an hour. And so it's a pretty simple process. And you get to know, the thing that's really cool about it is usually you get to know the people that are in the room having infusions, because you almost always have the same appointment times. And so you get to hear their stories, you get to know them, you get to talk to them, and it kind of makes you feel like, you're not as alone, which is kind of nice, to be honest.
Yeah. Because I'm sure that this could feel like a very difficult, lonely journey, even though there is a sense of community. The population that are affected by rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, it's a very special, group in that sense. There are a lot of individuals that are affected, but there's also not a lot at the same time, which is really interesting. But I'm also very curious that, one of the things that I was kind of thinking about was being able to go ahead and be in a world that isn't always accommodating towards fluctuating health needs. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
I think that's a hard one. I think it was a little frustrating in the beginning, and I say beginning as in the first 4 years, so up until this past year. This year in particular, I have been really frustrated by it, and it's not directed towards necessarily the people that write my check and my employers or my coworkers. It's not directed towards my kids. It's more directed to the fact that I am catching every disease these kids are bringing in. So kids are coming in with colds and flus, or not flus, but like colds and they're coming in sick. Um, and I don't know if it's because we're not as fearful as COVID maybe, because again, that's when I first started getting symptoms. But this year I've just got one thing after another, after another, after another, and it has just wrecked my system. And there's been a lot of nasty things I feel like this year, virus-wise, that we haven't seen in the past. So I'll be honest, like, you first get diagnosed and you see all these Instagram like people that are posting and they're like, but you don't look sick or you don't, and you almost like roll your eyes and you're like, okay, autoimmune diseases aren't illnesses. Like you can still go live a good life and do all these things. And then this year happens and you're like, I used to have this life where I could just go where I want and do what I want. And now I have to like actually think about who am I spending time with and where am I going and what is my energy source like? And it's a whole new, almost like ball game, I guess you would say, that I'm not used to,
Yeah, it sounds like you've unlocked a new character.
unfortunately.
It's like a new skin, same person, different a different skin, in this character, and you just have to go ahead and kinda consider a little bit more, be more intentional with what you're doing from what it sounds like.
Yeah. So that's been hard because it does. It messes with a lot of things, If you're sick, you're not engaging in your Christian community at church, which it's great to watch online. It's not the same thing though to be in a room of believers or, sometimes as teachers we do like to get together after hours and go for dinner and just catch up and because we don't really see each other, throughout the day and of course your traditional friends that have nothing to do with your field, nothing to do with your faith, you just want to hang out with and then it's like, you're like, "Sorry, I'm sick again. Like, let's do it another day." It kind of is depressing in that, like, spending time with your friends, spending time with your family, going to church, all of that is great for your mental health, and then you also have to consider, "I don't wanna get them sick," "I'm homesick." So, it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Your company logo for faith-filled teaching highlights behavioral wellness and faith.
Mhm.
How do you integrate those 3 pillars to help someone move towards independence and dignity?
I think the behavioral side of things is making sure we're very detailed in tracking our symptoms, tracking, water intake, step intake, also tracking like this is where I think doctors kind of gave me a little pushback is like tracking labs. Like I'm not trying to interpret what a doctor gives to you. So if a doctor runs what's called an ANA panel, which is a panel that basically shows whatever autoimmune disease you could possibly catch, it'll flag on this panel. I'm not sitting here and saying here's what I think that means. What I'm doing is I'm taking that panel, taking that data, and I'm saying, okay, let's try and maybe decrease your caffeine intake, or let's and do what's called a reversal design to see if it helps your symptoms. And if it also makes those labs go in the right direction, meaning that some of those inflammation markers go down, then we're in the right track. But I'm not going to sit here and say, here's what I think you have you know, and my coworker or not my coworker, my, BCBA supervisor and I were actually talking about a case that I had. And I said, "I'm not a doctor by any means." And I said, "But just looking from her labs, I could see why doctors are saying what they're saying to her, unfortunately." And so it's that moment of like, how do you approach this situation? Because that information could be hard to hear no matter who it's coming from, but also I think, we wanna be able to know what we're treating too. And obviously we can't diagnose and we can't prescribe medication, but I would approach a patient with lupus a very different way than I would approach, say, a patient with, I don't know, a different autoimmune disease, something that's psoriasis. I would approach that a whole lot differently. So it's interesting to navigate.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. You mentioned to me that providing behavioral analytic support for things like symptom tracking and building health routines. Can you walk us through how data informed strategies can actually help someone feel more empowered over their own bodies?
Yeah, I think part of it is like, it can be hard to sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you just think this is what it is. This is what it's always been. Like, so for me, it's like, it's always the muscle weakness in the legs, or it's always this, it's always that. But there's different levels too. So one day my might be pronated out. The next day I might need to be holding on things to walk. And I think it's so much more helpful to have a provider walk alongside you because they're able to take the emotions, I guess, out of the experience and look at it from a clinical standpoint of view. Even listening to my patient and hearing her story and hearing a lot of the overlap with my journey, I'm still able to be like, okay, like let's look at this as a holistic view. Let's look at it from a behavioral lens, um, and take that emotion, I guess you would say, out of it.
Makes sense. Teacher, you've seen how environments need to be flexible. What are some of the
Mhm.
practical ways that schools or workplaces can better accommodate individuals with fluctuating health needs so that they can still thrive?
This is a tricky one because the way they can accommodate, unfortunately, sometimes requires a doctor's diagnosis or a doctor's prescription. And it just so happens every time I go to the doctor for my rheumatologist, I'm in great condition, which is great for them. They love to see that their things are working, but very seldom, if ever, have I had a scheduled appointment where I'm in a flare. And so as a result, I've asked for like a doctor's note for something as simple as like elevator access that I can just use when I'm in a flare, and they would not give it to me because I was doing so well. So simple things like that are really, I guess you would say, helpful to have. So yeah, that's been interesting to navigate.
Hmm. Anything that you could think of or that you wish could happen that wouldn't require a doctor's note?
I think, oh, that's a good question. I honestly think, to be honest, being able to hold IEPs virtually, we had no problem saying that was okay in the pandemic, right? Because we were in a lockdown for health reasons. But now that we're not in a pandemic, they're so hesitant to do that. And I find it interesting that we worked so hard to create these systems, and now we're saying, no, we're not going to do that.
Right. Especially for individuals that come from lower social economic backgrounds that may not necessarily have the luxury of being able to attend in-person IEPs and those IEP meetings. I could assume that just becomes extremely difficult for them.
Yeah, this year in particular, I found like we're constantly rescheduling appointments, and I have never had as much challenges. And it's not the first time I've worked in this area, but it's the first time I've actually had challenges trying to get people to the table. And I don't know if that's from just the lack of understanding of what an IEP actually is, or if it's like we understand, but we've been doing this for 6 years and like it's not changed very much over the course of 6 years that we don't think it's really important to come to the table. I don't know where the disconnect is, but somewhere there's a disconnect. And then I also know parents are usually working, and so it's hard for them to take time off too to come to these appointments.
Absolutely. Self-advocacy is a huge part of what you teach. What
Mhm.
advice do you have for someone who feels guilty about their health limitations or is afraid to ask for accommodations that they may need?
So this is an interesting conversation because I'm not perfect at all. So in the beginning of the year, some of my coworkers and I were talking about the elevator conversation. I said, I've had so much PTSD from my past experiences of trying to advocate for myself that I said, I love what you're doing, but respectfully, like I need to take a back seat. And it wasn't that like I didn't want to advocate, it was more a matter of like position in the company. So like my coworkers had tenure, so their job is less likely to be pulled from them. And I think when it comes to advocacy, I think the conversation needs to be shifted as far as advocating for yourself is not a bad thing, but also we shouldn't be fearful either of advocating for ourselves. And like I said, I'm not perfect, obviously, but it's something we need to do, and the narrative isn't going to shift until we start.
Yeah. As we conclude, is there one key message or piece of advice that you'd want our listeners to take away from today's conversation as it relates towards destigmatizing mental health and chronic illness? What would that be?
I think my biggest thing would be that your chronic illness is not something you did wrong, and it's not um like a lack of faith um that you're currently experiencing, I guess you would say. So to just stay strong and to just trust that, this process might take a little bit longer than you'd hope, but hopefully with the right doctors, with the right prayer, with the right people in your corner, you will one of two things. you'll either get the right diagnosis and right treatment, or you will get healing without having to go through all these hoops, like I did. That's probably my biggest thing is just like stay the course and stay strong.
Once again, Lisa, how could people connect with you?
And my Instagram is faithfield_teaching, and I post a lot of stuff over there. And then I have my emails as well and my website as well.
I always like to ask my guests, is there anything that maybe I didn't ask you or something that you wanted to talk about that I didn't get to?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I mean, I don't know. I think we covered it all. I mean, we talked about my dad's journey a little bit, I think, right? Did we talk about that? I think we covered everything.
Awesome. Well, this was Destigmatized Mental Health Podcast, Season 5, Episode 4, highlighting autoimmune advocacy and behavioral wellness with Lisa Gartner from Faithful Teaching. You can share this episode and listen to past episodes of Destigmatized Mental Health Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.